Hi, I'm Tamara, and this is TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. Hi, everyone. Today I'm speaking with Clayton Thomas Mueller. Clayton is a Cree activist and writer from Canada. He just wrote this book, Life in the City of Dirty Water. It's a fantastic conversation all about his memoir and his passion, climate change. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Hi, Clayton. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing really good.
It's so good to see you. I'm so excited about this because I read a review of your book. So your book is called Life in the City of Dirty Water. This is what it looks like. And I read a review. Yes, you have it too. And I thought, oh, this sounds really good. And then I was walking through the bookstore, and sure enough, there it was. The most beautiful cover I've ever seen. It's just stunning, the cover. And I bought the book. And I wanted to interview you right away.
Wow.
Your story, and your ability to share is what I think is going to help all of us move forward. What was it like writing this book?
Um, well, I mean, it was pretty traumatizing, if I'm being honest. I mean, one of the big goals of writing Life in the City of Dirty Water was, my own mental health and, trying to, I guess, learn a practice of mindfulness in my life. I've been a lead global campaigner holding the fossil fuel sector accountable over Indigenous rights and, our rapidly destabilizing climate my entire adult life. So it's a pretty stressful job. And on top of that, when you're born Indigenous in a country like Canada, your life is political no matter what, for a number of reasons, namely the echoes of colonization, which still continue to ring so strongly in our society. So, for me, writing this book was about trying to, be more present for my sons. I have two boys that I'm a father to, and I was having a really hard time. And I talked to my therapist about it. And, he said, well, it's really normal for people who have survived Indian residential school or the children of survivors of Indian residential school to exhibit patterns of dissociative behavior and, other challenges, from Indian residential school intergenerational syndrome, which is what they call, I guess, Indigenous people's unique style of PTSD. And he said, and so when you're parenting and you see your children at the ages that they're at, no matter what age they're at, they're like mirrors to parents, and they'll reflect back to you the experiences, positive or negative, that you went through at that age. And for people living with trauma, that triggers your fight or flight response, and it can make you not present in the moment. And so he told me to, keep coming to therapy and go to ceremonies, smoke my pipe. And but he also said that, when you get triggered, you should write it down. You should start practice of journaling, identify what triggered you, and then start to question that kind of thinking behavior, just kind of cognitive psychotherapy tools. And so I wrote my memoir, first edition of it, but it was really, really quite dark and just messed up. And and releasing that set of stories would have traumatized a lot of people in my life that I really love and that I'm on this journey with, still to this day. And so I had to reevaluate the whole process. And I was working with a filmmaker at the time. I make films as well. The listeners can watch my film Life in the City of Dirty Water on CBC Gem for free. It lives there. And it's part of this bigger project, which the memoir is also a part of, a whole three-dimensional kind of transmedia storytelling universe, my ode to Winnipeg, if you will. But yeah, it was really intense, but it was also, I think, very healing, because I think for anybody considering writing, the literary world is a really hardcore lesson in patience. It takes like 2-3 years to get a book to market, and there's a whole bunch of things. So, when I finally got through the editing process with Penguin Allen Lane Publishers, it was a couple of years deep into it, and I was really happy to finally get out what I felt was just the right amount of myself to share with the world, to stimulate a conversation that this book has given me a platform to have with this country, which is to talk about the answers to the question, what is it going to take for us to move through and heal from the violence of colonialism? And and I'm engaged in that process right now.
So what was it like you grew up in Winnipeg,
Yeah.
um, an Indigenous boy in Winnipeg. What was that like?
Well, I mean, Winnipeg is an awesome city. It gets such a bad rep. Poverty it breeds a lot of terrible things. Communities that are cash poor, that are rife with trauma. A lot of bad things go down. But the city of Winnipeg has got a deep, deep soul, and it also has a rep as being the biggest urban reservation on the continent, right? And so if you grow up here native compared to anywhere else in Canada, you feel kind of comfortable. It's like when you see other native people everywhere you go, and so you feel seen. When you see your own people, everywhere in the stores and in the schools and in the libraries, yeah. So growing up here, I mean, it was a mixed bag. I grew up with a lot of domestic violence in my home. My mother's partners, were violent growing up, and um, that was very difficult to deal with. And like a lot of Indigenous peoples, I think a lot of the trauma that I share in life in the city of Dirty Water is not my own unique experience. Whether it was participating in gang culture or going through physical, emotional, spiritual, and sexual abuse as a child. These challenges have been things that our people have been dealing with because of what they went through collectively at Indian Residential School, or at one of the health hospitals they used to send our people to for TB. They were just as bad, if not worse, than residential schools, but you don't hear much about those. And I think growing up in Winnipeg, even as a father now, I'm still experiencing life here, and I think that's one of the big themes of life in the city of Dirty Water is that we're not living in a post-colonial society. Like truth and reconciliation is an intergenerational process that'll persist for a long time. Certainly, at least until there are tangible responses at the scale of the crisis from this government. We will continue to see things like what happened in Fort Smith, Cree Nation, the tragedy in Saskatchewan. I take my hat off to everybody in Saskatchewan who went through that tragedy. So many of our families were touched. But bad things happen on the res every day, and really violent things. And it's because of the austerity agenda of the government of Canada and the failure of this country to honor its agreements with Indigenous peoples, which the spirit and intent of are two canoes in a river going in the same direction, not interrupting each other's paths. That's the whole idea. And all the while, Canadians, they're brainwashed, from a well-funded propaganda campaign from the private extractive sector and from the federal government that Natives somehow are freeloaders and that we don't pay taxes and all of these horribly racist people say. The fact of the matter is that Native people have been subsidizing the wealth of non-Indigenous Canadians since the dawn of this country, and we have to change the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up so many things there that I could, springboard off of for sure. And we've had many of these conversations on this podcast with other Indigenous leaders and authors who, all say the same thing. It's not like, there's no argument there for a lot of us, right? I guess when I think about the truth, right? Because we need the truth before we can move on to the reconciliation. And the truth seems really hard for a lot of people. And or they're not interested in the truth, or I'm not even sure what it means, but you said brainwashed, right? And I found that very interesting because I do feel like you probably nailed it right there, because I was told all the things you mentioned as a young girl, right? I was told all those things. You don't pay taxes and all this and all that. And it's not until I became an adult that I realized things, that, you don't own the home you live in. You don't own the reserve. You don't own you know what I mean? And these are all things that we don't, I don't want to say we don't know. There is no reason for us to not know, right? It's on us to know this. But it's still, I can't comprehend how we still have communities where there isn't potable water. I just don't, I can't make that work in my brain.
We live in a G8 economy, right? Like one of the richest economies on the planet that just so happens to be the one economy out of the G8 economies that has the most freshwater resources on the planet. So yeah, it's absolutely ludicrous and it doesn't make any sense. And I've mentioned this before, but for those older listeners that remember the explosion of social movement activity during Idle No More in 2012 in response to the conservative Harper agenda, the omnibus bill agenda, when he was, putting all these horrible pieces of legislation into, must pass legislation. It was real shady. At that time, Chief Teresa Spence from Attawapiskat was in Ottawa protesting, and then, people responded to that, and Idle No More came out of that. And, at that time, the reason Chief Teresa Spence did that fast for 80 plus days was because she was protesting the fact that a gold mining company, a South African apartheid gold mining company, De Beers, is operating in their territory, and they attached their man camp sewage system to the little tiny reservation's water and sanitation sewage system. And it backed up all that miners' waste into First Nations homes at minus 40-degree weather in a fly-in only community. And the government didn't do anything about it. And I was living in Ottawa with my family at the time. And I remember taking my kids to the canal, and they had these fancy ice shacks, I think a dozen of them, $1 million a piece they spent on these ice shacks so that commuters who work at the Parliament could ice skate to work, and that they could have these fancy architecturally designed ice shacks to change their skates into, from their fancy neighborhoods along the canal. And what's crazy about it is that they could have fixed all those houses in the water and sanitation sewage system in Attawapiskat for less than $4 million. And that same year, they spent $12 million on ice skate shacks on the canal.
I think that we could probably come up with dozens of examples like that, right? Dozens. So then it becomes, okay, this is the stuff we know. And what I want to know about you, Clayton, is how you went from, you had a very traumatic upbringing, and you experienced a lot as a young boy, as a young man. And, you spent time at juvie.
Yeah.
So tell me what that is like, because I think that's something that we never talk about. We never talk about kids who, we hear about these, bad kids, they go to juvenile detention and then we don't hear anything else. We don't know the stories that come out of there. Why were you in juvie?
Well, I mean, I think juvie was a crescendo in my adolescence. Part of a much larger, symphony of what colonization does to a young Indigenous person growing up in Canada, and growing up with systemic racism and gaslighting. Being gaslit and wondering why you're ashamed to say you're Cree, why you tell other kids in kindergarten you're Italian. Being a native kid, like the first generation to go to public schools in Canada at a residential school, like that was me. Like, I was the first in my family not to go to residential school. And when they did the process of deracial segregation in the United States, they had the frickin' National Guard with machine guns escorting black kids into schools in the South, right? And when they desegregated like the apartheid school system here in Canada in the 80s, and they put all of us native kids in the school, there was no National Guard there to protect us from the racist teachers and kids and parents and, like faculty. It was a really shitty time. Pardon my language. It was a really lame time. And, you know, and I think that for me, I never did. I dropped out of school in grade 8, and I never went back because it was a very challenging experience. And I think that a lot of Indigenous kids, over the years have had the exact same experience. I think things have gotten a lot better with community self-determination of the Native community over education curriculum and the creation of Indigenous schools like Children of the Earth here in Winnipeg, where I live. We've seen a lot more control over education by First Nations, especially in the North. But there's still a long way to go with our education system, and I think that there's still this massive erasure and this like really kind of insidious narrative about pan-indigeneity that the school system teaches Canadians and immigrants and First Nations, that kind of paint us out to be a monolith as Indigenous peoples, and that put us as pages on a history book. When the reality of it is that we've got 630 plus language groups in the country, divided into 56 languages, divided into 6 different language groups, with the difference between one group being Polish to Chinese to the other. Like super diversity. I mean, there are commonalities that unite us, like our connection to the sacredness of Mother Earth through our worldview and our cosmology, but we're very different. And I think the other thing is that when we look at current global challenges that we face as society, as members of the Five-Fingered Nation, race is a construct. Um, we have to understand that Indigenous peoples globally hold a key to how we're going to move forward and survive, the existential threat of climate change, global issues like pandemic, like the military industrial complex, never-ending wars, and of course, economic recession at a scale that we've never seen before. Indigenous peoples know how to adapt, and because we were forced to, and we can show human beings how to mitigate and adapt to our rapidly changing climate. And the biggest migration of human beings that has ever happened in our collective history is underway right now, because of rising sea levels. And this is all stuff that's happening real time in our
Mhm.
lifetimes. So I think Indigenous
It is happening in real time, and it
yeah,
brings a great sense of dread to, I mean, I see it in my kids and older, right? Like especially teens and people in their 20s, and it's we're watching people all around us make decisions that are not good for
yeah.
the world that we live in. They're not good for Mother Earth, and I think that people feel, Clayton, like they don't have any control. They don't. Nobody's listening, is what it feels like.
Well, there's an important word that I mentioned, and I'll say it again. I think that's that glimmer of hope that people need to grab onto, and they need to cultivate it like a medicine plant and help it grow. And that is community self-determination. At the end of the day, the solution to climate change is not the Paris Climate Accord. It's not like the World Bank International Carbon Trading Facility. It's not forest offsets. It's not carbon net zero and all this BS that people are talking about. It's communities having water security, food security, and having community self-determination over democratic, governance models that are biospherically designed, that reinforce our role as human beings to take care of our circle of life. That's what Indigenous peoples have been taught, that, we're here to speak for those that cannot speak for themselves, and that's our plant and animal relatives that we depend on, and they depend on us. And so, I think that I get great hope in this moment by seeing what these young people are doing. You mentioned you have got teenagers. I've got a 16 and a 14-year-old, and it's crazy the intersectional analysis that these young people have today, and they're out there protesting by the hundreds of thousands for Fridays for Future, for the global climate strikes, and Black Lives Matter. And, I'm seeing younger and younger people come out with like really hardcore like support of land back, of Black Lives Matter, of the LBG, the lesbian, gay, bi transgender community, like there's just a really profound thing that's happening. And I think like especially the rise of the sacred female creative principle in its manifestation in indigenous women's leadership. We see that in our communities, and at the front line of our social movements is these powerful indigenous women who are reminding and lifting up, the vital and sacred role that indigenous women's leadership plays in our matrilineal societies. These are things that we're debating in our own community and healing in our own community, all the while participating in these bigger conversations. Like what the hell are we going to do about climate change? And I think you mentioned leadership. I think that that's where I have great faith in these young people, is that we're building the biggest social movement in the history of humankind. And, these leaders are one of the last kind of bosses in this game, where they either going to make the right decisions in the next 6 years, or they will be removed and replaced with leaders who will. And, there'll be some big challenges that come with that. But I have great faith in the connection that young people have to the earth, to each other, and to the universe.
Yeah, I do too. I do too, for sure. One of the things we like to do on this podcast is ask our guests to choose a Canadian nonprofit, because we like to give them $500 in your name for you being here. And you chose the New Directions for Children, Youth, Adults, and Families, specifically their Indigenous youth program. Yeah. And we're going to give them $500. But you were telling me before we started that they really need this money.
They do, and I was big shout out to New Directions and to Darlene Daniels, who's one of my mentors, a leader here in the Winnipeg community. She runs a lot of their Indigenous programming in the city, but New Directions does incredible frontline work supporting young parents, young Indigenous parents. Young people who might have had a brush with the law and they just need some support. They do peer-to-peer counseling, and they've got this dynamic Indigenous youth program, Indigenous youth leadership program. And recently there was a fire at the facility, and their drum and their pipe, their sacred medicine bundle, all got destroyed in the fire. So this donation, right after Every Child Matters Day, is a really powerful way, that Telus and myself, that we could come together for community here in the city of Winnipeg. So yeah.
Well, that's great. I'm happy that we can do that. So thank you, and thank you for being here. So the reason I asked you about juvie and your upbringing and how tough it was is because listening to you now, you clearly have found your path and your passion, right? Like listening to you speak about climate change and the earth and our relationship with earth, and that this is like your whole face lights up, and this is your life's work, obviously. And the reason I ask you about your childhood and that is because I think it was Helen Knott who wrote in her book, In My Own Moccasins, she wrote about, her parents going to residential schools too, and how her parents had never been parented properly because their parents were at residential school.
Yeah.
And so therefore her parents didn't know how to parent, and then they had and so I had never looked at it through that lens before, and it actually really helped me in my own life too. Like when you understand the trauma that your parents may have had, and it didn't allow them to ever know how to parent properly, how to be a mom, how to be a dad. So I'm wondering how, because that obviously was your experience too, right? You were being raised by traumatized people. And how did you find your way as a parent?
Yeah. Well, that was a really difficult process. you know, my mother is my best friend, like next to my kid's mom. Those two women in my life, they're my bestest friends in the whole world. You know, and my mom and we've had a lot of difficult conversations because, I had some fairly abusive father figures in my life, but my mom was probably the most abusive, like physically. She had a lot of issues growing up, but I mean, I look at what she went through. I mean, her parents would disappear for months at a time. And, she was horrified to call CFS because she knew that they would break up the kids. They'd send them all to different places. And so she would take my aunties and uncles to the dump at Lynn Lake, Manitoba, and they would pick through, the garbage to find anything to eat. And then, at some point in the fall, the RCMP would show up and steal them again and take them back to residential school. And year after subsequent year, my grandparents became more and more just lost in alcohol, and they just kind of gave up. And I think that my mom went through all of that, but still somehow managed to find the courage to leave the res and come to Winnipeg and try to give me a better quality of life, more choices, better education. And it was a rough go the first while. A lot of bad shit went down. And so, her and I worked through a lot of that stuff and forgave each other for that stuff. And it was very important for me to have her consent to write my story. And that's why she wrote the foreword in my book. And it was very important, in this era of consent, that I have that, especially from my mom. Um, and with my father, he passed away 16 years ago. It was actually the day the doctors told us that my son Felix was conceived was when my dad died. And we never got to work out all this stuff. But the one thing I did promise myself was that, when he was alive, was that I would never beat him up. All my brothers fought my father and either got their asses kicked by him because he was tough as hell, or beat his ass. And I managed to make it to his journey to the good hunting grounds, not slap his ass out, because when he drank, boy, he'd say some horrible things, especially about my mom. And so, but I think at the end of the day, all of the lessons that I've taken from growing up native in one of Canada's inner cities, if anything, reinforced a commitment to being the most loving and caring, father to my sons. And I'm just, I'm very loving with them. They're men now. They're bigger than me and all that. They can ragdoll me and like my one son Felix is like 6'3". It's huge, and but they still come snuggle with dad, and like, they're very loving, and it's a really good journey to be on with them because yeah, my mother and I have joked about this for the last few years, but we call this time during pandemic when family could just hang out with family, the project. And we spent a lot of this time, you know, creating a language environment where my sons could be exposed to Cree, pick up the Cree, and where we could talk with all of the cousins and with my sons and all my nieces and nephews who all come to visit grandma. We could talk about the negative cycles in our collective experience that we want to replace with positive cycles moving forward. And yeah, so I hope everybody use Every Child Matters National Truth and Reconciliation Day to talk to your families about residential school. Uh, Talk about these things with your families, and see where the conversation goes. You don't just have to do it on that one day of the year either. You do it, whenever these issues come up. It's good to, there's lots of online resources to help parents guide conversations, or to help, sons and daughters guide conversations with their parents, or that one mega uncle that only comes at Thanksgiving and says a bunch of racist shit. Like there's lots of tools out there online. It's
No, you're absolutely
yeah.
right. You're right. And that's not easy to do, Clayton. It's not easy to have tumultuous relationship with a parent and then be able to work through and be transparent and have those conversations and get to a place of forgiveness. It is, I mean, some of us work our entire lives trying to make that happen. So, the fact that, you speak so fondly of your mom in that way, right? To do that work now. And that is a huge, that is a huge thing. I mean, many of us would give a lot to be able to get to that place, because it's not easy for you. You know what I mean? For the person, for the little boy, because we carry that trauma with us through our lives, right? Always. And things get triggered or things get whatever it might be. So I in a very roundabout way, I'm trying to say that I'm very, I want to say I'm envious that you have done that, or I'm proud of you, but I don't know you, so I can't say that. But you know what I mean? Like, I just think it's really amazing. And
Yeah.
because I know how hard it is.
And it's just not without suffering, I really implore, all the listeners, especially like, don't matter if you're fifth generation or one generation, or you just got, you yourself and your family just moved to Canada this generation. It's really important to talk about colonialism and truth and reconciliation and systemic racism, institutional racism, is another word for it, because, like I just think that, when we look at Canada, 31 million people, 87% of those people are what Native people call white presenting, or they can pass as somebody with a European heritage. And, within that, it's just one of those out of sight, out of mind things. It's why the police can, go into places like Wet'suwet'en up in northern BC and bring in, terror dogs and helicopters and machine guns to unarmed women and children living on their trap line. Is because people don't see what the state is doing. They don't see it. They don't see how the police act in a Native-only community. They don't see the kind of difference in police response to an Indigenous person versus a non-Indigenous person. Y'all don't see those things. And so until racism and colonialism, settler colonialism, become a white person's issue in this country, these problems are going to persist. And that's where, like, I'm not saying that folks got to change everybody's opinions, but what I am saying is that people need to spend some time to take some of this burden of proof off of brown and black people and deal with this stuff in your own communities, because we're dealing with a bunch of internalized oppression and internalized racism, internalized patriarchy, like all kinds of messed up stuff in our own communities, kind of in a peer-to-peer counseling, crisis intervention sort of way. And I think that all of us have all of this work in our communities if we're going to find more success in the times when we come together to not just overcome collective challenges like the pandemic and climate change and recession, but also, moments when we come together to celebrate, our great accomplishments. So.
Absolutely. It's been so good talking to you, really. The book is called Life in the City of Dirty Water. It's right here. And also the film is on CBC Gem and it's free. And this book is everywhere you buy books, whether you do it online or in person, you can find the book. A memoir of healing. I love it. And Clayton, you are on... Your website is lifeinthecityofdirtywater.com, and your Twitter account is @Cree Clayton.
That's right.
Do you like tweeting? Do you tweet a lot?
Oh, yeah.
I'm about to go follow you. Oh, good.
Yeah.
I'm about to go follow you.
Anybody who writes Clayton, for the media, does news, does journalism, we're all about Twitter. So.
Oh, there you go. Well, listen, I've really appreciated the conversation, and yeah, Clayton, there's so much to say to you. Like, really, we've run out of time, but
well, thanks.
It's given me a lot to think about. So thank you so much.
Yeah, this is a real treat. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. Be sure to subscribe so you can join us every Tuesday for another conversation. You can also check out our website, tellus.com/podcast, and subscribe to our YouTube channel at TELUS Talks.